The blood pooled beneath Max's weathered hands as he desperately tried to stop the flow from the dog's mangled body. Somehow, in his 73 years of life, he'd never witnessed something so devastating yet so pure. A creature who had once feared and bit him, now lying broken on the road, having given everything to save him. The rain mixed with his tears as the dog's eyes, once wild with distrust, now gazed up at him with nothing but devotion. What could possibly drive an animal once so afraid of humans to sacrifice everything for one? What invisible thread connects souls that have no reason to trust each other? If you're hearing this story for the first time, I urge you to subscribe to Canine Code Red channel, where stories of extraordinary canine heroism come to life. Listen closely to what follows, as the journey of an abandoned police dog named Shadow and a lonely retired officer will reveal truths about loyalty and redemption that words alone cannot capture. Chapter 1. The encounter. Frank Reynolds drove his weathered pickup down the winding forest road like he did every Tuesday, the familiar route to his fishing spot etched into his memory after 15 years of retirement. The former police sergeant had left behind the chaos of Boston PD for the solitude of Vermont's Green Mountains, where his only companions were the tall pines and occasional deer that bounded across his property. That April morning carried the first genuine warmth of spring, sunlight dappling through fresh green leaves that had only just unfurled. Frank's windows were rolled down, allowing the scent of damp earth and pine to fill the cab. His arthritis wasn't acting up as badly as usual, and he'd even managed to load his fishing gear without the stabbing pain in his lower back that typically accompanied such efforts. Then he saw it, a flash of movement in the underbrush alongside the rarely traveled mountain road. Frank might have been retired, but 2 decades on the force had honed his peripheral vision to catch what others missed. He eased off the accelerator, squinting through the morning light. A yelp, high-pitched and desperate, cut through the forest sounds. "What in God's name?" Frank muttered, pulling his truck onto the shoulder and reaching for the flashlight he still habitually kept in his glove compartment. The sound came again, more urgent this time. Frank's knees protested as he climbed out of the truck, but he ignored the pain as he made his way carefully down the slight embankment. The underbrush was thick here, brambles catching on his jacket as he pushed through. "Hello?" he called, then felt foolish. Whatever was making that sound wasn't human. Through a gap in the foliage, he spotted it, a young German shepherd, no more than 8 or 9 months old from the look of it, caught in what appeared to be an illegal trap. The dog's rear leg was clamped in the metal teeth of a spring trap, the kind Frank knew had been outlawed in the state for years. The animal's coat was matted and filthy, ribs visible beneath dirty fur. It wore a tattered collar, with a partially torn tag that read "Shay," with the rest missing. When the dog saw Frank, it bared its teeth in a fearful snarl, trying desperately to back away, but held firmly by the trap. Fresh blood seeped from where the metal teeth bit into the animal's flesh. "Easy now," Frank said softly, the same tone he'd used countless times when approaching frightened witnesses or victims. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dog's amber eyes were wild with pain and fear. It lunged forward, snapping at the air between them, a warning that carried no small amount of desperation. Frank assessed the situation with the methodical approach that had been his trademark on the force. The trap was anchored to the ground with a short chain. The dog was dehydrated, likely trapped for at least a day, possibly longer. No houses for miles in this area. The collar suggested it belonged to someone, but its condition indicated it had been on its own for some time. "You're a police dog, aren't you?" Frank whispered, noticing the remnants of what might have been a K9 unit patch on the weathered collar. "What happened to your handler, boy?" Frank removed his jacket slowly, telegraphing his movements. "I'm going to help you," he said, knowing the animal couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone might communicate his intent. "But you're not going to like it." He approached cautiously, jacket held before him as a makeshift shield. The dog's growls intensified, the sound rumbling from deep in its chest. Frank had been bitten once before, years ago during a domestic disturbance call. The memory of those teeth tearing through flesh was not something easily forgotten. When he was close enough, Frank moved quickly, throwing the jacket over the dog's head to reduce its vision and hopefully calm it somewhat. The animal thrashed wildly, but the trap held it in place. Frank reached for the spring mechanism that would release the jaws. The trap was rusted, requiring more force than it should have. As Frank strained against the springs, the dog managed to wriggle its head free from the jacket. In an instant, teeth sank into Frank's forearm. Pain shot through his arm as he yelled, but he didn't pull back. With his free hand, he continued to work the mechanism until, with a metallic snap, the trap released. The dog, suddenly free, twisted away, but didn't flee as Frank expected. Instead, it collapsed a few feet away, its injured leg useless, body trembling with exhaustion and fear. It kept its eyes fixed on Frank, a low warning growl emanating from its throat. Blood dripped from the puncture wounds on Frank's arm. He wrapped his jacket around it as a temporary bandage, wincing at the pressure. The rational thing would be to leave now, call animal control from the safety of his truck. Let professionals handle a potentially dangerous animal. But something in the dog's eyes held him there. Behind the fear and aggression, Frank recognized something he'd seen too many times during his years on the force: trauma. "You and me," Frank said quietly, "we're not so different." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, the growl softening almost imperceptibly. Frank reached slowly into his pocket, retrieving the beef jerky he'd packed for his fishing trip. He tossed a piece halfway between them. The dog's nostrils flared, catching the scent. "Come on," Frank urged. "You need help, and I'm your best bet right now." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then painfully, the dog dragged itself forward, snatched the jerky, and retreated. Frank tossed another piece, slightly closer to himself this time. It took 45 minutes of patience, a full package of jerky, and a stream of gentle murmurs before the dog allowed Frank close enough to loop his belt around its neck as a makeshift leash. Even then, when he tried to lift the animal, it snapped at him again, teeth grazing his hand and drawing blood. "Have it your way," Frank grunted, backing off slightly. Eventually, through a combination of coaxing and careful maneuvering, he managed to get the dog to limp to the truck with him, though it resisted being lifted into the passenger seat. With one final effort, Frank hoisted the animal up, receiving another bite on his already wounded arm for his trouble. As Frank drove toward town, the dog huddled against the passenger door, as far from him as possible in the confined space, its eyes never leaving him, muscles tensed for fight or flight. Blood from its injured leg stained the upholstery Frank had meticulously maintained for years. "You've got a name on that collar," Frank said, glancing at the torn tag. "Shadow? Shamos?" He tried different names, watching for any reaction. When he said Shadow, the dog's ears perked slightly. "Shadow it is then," Frank decided. He hadn't planned on company, certainly not the four-legged kind that seemed intent on using him as a chew toy. But as he navigated the winding road toward Dr. Miller's veterinary clinic in town, Frank couldn't help but feel that his orderly, solitary life had just taken an unexpected turn. The blood on his arm throbbed with his heartbeat, a visceral reminder of the wild spirit now sharing his truck cab. Whatever Shadow's story was, Frank suspected it had started much like the stories of the most difficult cases he'd encountered during his years wearing the badge, with betrayal, abandonment, and pain. "We'll get you fixed up," he promised the trembling dog. "Then we'll figure out the rest." Chapter 2, Broken Trust. The waiting room of Miller Veterinary Clinic fell silent as Frank pushed through the door, blood seeping through his makeshift bandage, and a terrified, growling German shepherd limping reluctantly beside him on his belt leash. "Good Lord, Frank!" Ellen, the receptionist who'd known him for over a decade, jumped to her feet. "What happened to you?" "Found this one caught in a trap up near Carlton Ridge," Frank explained, wincing as he adjusted his grip on the makeshift leash. "He's hurt pretty bad, might be a police K-9. Tag says Shadow, I think." Dr. Sarah Miller emerged from an exam room, her eyes widening at the scene. At 42, she'd been the town's only vet for nearly 15 years, and Frank had brought her injured wildlife before, but never like this. "Exam room 3 is open," she said calmly, though her eyes registered concern as she noted the blood on Frank's arm. "Can you get him in there?" Shadow growled, hackles raised, as Frank tried to guide him forward. Every attempt to touch the dog resulted in snapping teeth and renewed growling. "He's not exactly cooperating," Frank said dryly. Sarah disappeared briefly, returning with a muzzle and a determined expression. "Let's try this." 20 minutes, 2 more bites, and a considerable amount of coaxing later, they managed to get the muzzled Shadow into the exam room. The dog trembled violently on the metal table as Sarah examined the wound on his leg. "This is at least 2 days old," she said, gently cleaning the area. "He's severely dehydrated and malnourished. I'd guess he's been on his own for weeks." While she worked on Shadow, a nurse cleaned and bandaged Frank's arm. The puncture wounds were deep but had missed anything vital. "You'll need antibiotics," the nurse advised. "Dog bites can get nasty infections." Frank barely heard her, his attention fixed on Shadow and Dr. Miller. "I've seen this before," Sarah said quietly as she worked. "He's got scars that predate the trap. Someone mistreated this dog." She pointed to healed marks on Shadow's rib cage. "These are cigarette burns, and these," she indicated scars on his muzzle, "are consistent with a tight wire muzzle left on too long." Frank felt a familiar anger stirring in his chest, the same righteous indignation that had fueled his police work. Animal abuse cases had always hit him particularly hard. "He's got a police K-9 collar," Frank noted. "Can you check for a microchip?" Sarah ran the scanner over Shadow's trembling body. "There is one," she confirmed, then frowned at the reading. "That's odd. It's registered to Canton County Sheriff's Department, but it's been deactivated in the system." "Deactivated? Sometimes they do that when..." Sarah didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Frank understood. When a K-9 officer was deemed unsuitable for service, or worse, dangerous. "Maybe I can make some calls," Frank suggested. "I still know people." Sarah continued her examination, administering fluids for dehydration and cleaning the trap wound. "He'll need surgery to repair some of this damage," she said finally, "and he's going to need somewhere to recover afterward." Frank knew what she was suggesting even before she looked up at him with questioning eyes. "I'm not exactly set up for a dog," he protested weakly, "especially not one that seems determined to use me as a chew toy." Sarah's expression softened. "Frank, you've been alone in that cabin for what, 7 years since Carol passed. Maybe it's time for some company." Frank looked at Shadow, who despite the muzzle and sedation was still watching him warily, muscles tensed as if expecting a blow at any moment. "He hates me," Frank pointed out. "He's afraid," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference, and he didn't run when the trap released him. That says something." Frank ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. "What am I supposed to do with a traumatized former police dog?" "The same thing you did with those traumatized kids you used to mentor at the youth center," Sarah replied simply. "Give him time, space, and consistency." By late afternoon, Shadow was out of surgery. Frank's truck now contained antibiotics for himself, medication and special food for Shadow, and an assortment of basic dog supplies Sarah had insisted he would need. "Call me if anything changes," she instructed as Frank coaxed Shadow, still sedated and confused, into the truck. "And Frank, be patient. This isn't going to be easy." That prediction proved to be an understatement. The first night in Frank's cabin was a standoff. Shadow, his leg bandaged and a plastic cone around his neck to prevent him from tearing at the stitches, refused to leave the corner of the living room where Frank had set up a makeshift bed of old blankets. The dog wouldn't eat while Frank was watching and growled whenever he came too close. Frank slept fitfully in his recliner, rather than his bedroom, unwilling to leave the injured animal alone. Sometime around 3 a.m., he awoke to the sound of water lapping. Shadow had finally crept to the bowl Frank had left out. "About time," Frank murmured sleepily. The dog froze, then retreated quickly to his corner, wincing as the movement jostled his injured leg. "It's okay," Frank said softly. "That's yours. You can have it." Shadow stared at him with those amber eyes that seemed to hold both wariness and intelligence. Frank had seen that look before, in witnesses who'd been threatened, in victims who'd been told no one would believe them, in rookie officers who'd been betrayed by partners they trusted. "Someone really did a number on you, didn't they?" Frank said quietly. The next 3 days established a tense routine. Shadow would only eat when Frank stepped away, would only sleep when Frank was across the room, and reacted with snapping teeth to any attempt at physical contact. The cone prevented the worst of the biting, but Shadow made his feelings abundantly clear. On the 4th day, Frank called the Canton County Sheriff's Department. After navigating a labyrinth of transfers and holds, he finally reached someone who knew something about Shadow. That dog was a washout. The K-9 unit supervisor, Lieutenant Wilson, told him bluntly. Too aggressive, couldn't complete training. We sold him to a private trainer who said he could work with problem cases. This private trainer, Frank pressed, his old investigative instincts kicking in. You have a name, Martin Reeves, I think. Look, that was over a year ago. If the dog's causing problems, he's not causing problems. Frank interrupted, looking over at Shadow, who was watching him intently from his corner. He's had problems caused for him. After hanging up, Frank did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his old laptop and began researching. Martin Reeves wasn't hard to find. 3 complaints of animal cruelty, no convictions. A website advertising behavior modification for problem dogs with testimonials. Frank strongly suspected were fabricated. A foreclosure notice from 8 months ago. So he lost his property and dumped you, Frank said aloud. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Or you escaped. Either way, you've been on your own a while. That evening, Frank tried a different approach. Instead of leaving Shadow's food and walking away, he sat on the floor about 10 feet from the bowl, a book in his hand, pretending to read. Shadow stared at the food, then at Frank, clearly hungry, but unwilling to approach. I'm not moving, Frank told him. You're going to have to get used to me sooner or later. An hour passed. Frank's back ached from sitting on the hard floor, but he remained still, occasionally turning a page in his book, though he'd absorbed none of the words. Finally, Shadow inched forward, eyes never leaving Frank, and quickly gulped down the food before retreating. Frank allowed himself a small smile. That's progress. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Each day, Frank moved the food bowl a foot closer to himself. Each day, Shadow reluctantly adjusted, always watching, always ready to retreat. The biting decreased, though any sudden movement or attempt to touch the dog still triggered a defensive snap. Dr. Miller came to the cabin to remove Shadow's stitches, impressed with the healing but concerned about his continued fear responses. He's been through hell, she observed, as Shadow cowered from her touch, despite the previous gentle treatment at the clinic. This kind of rehabilitation takes time, Frank, and specialized training you don't have. Are you suggesting I give up on him? Frank asked, more sharply than he'd intended. Sarah smiled. No, I'm warning you that this is going to test your patience in ways you can't imagine. But if anyone's stubborn enough to see it through, it's you. After she left, Frank sat in his usual spot on the floor, this time with the food bowl directly beside him. Shadow paced the perimeter of the room, hunger warring with fear. I know what you're thinking, Frank said conversationally. You're wondering if the food is worth dealing with the human. I used to ask myself the same thing about people. Is this particular headache worth the trouble? Shadow stopped pacing, watching him. The thing is, Frank continued, sometimes it is. Sometimes you find something worth the trouble. He thought of Carol, of how loving her had been worth every argument, every compromise, every painful moment of her final illness. Worth it all, and then some. Shadow took a tentative step forward, then another. That's it, Frank encouraged softly. I'm not him. I'm not any of them who hurt you. For the first time, Shadow ate while Frank remained beside the bowl. He didn't try to touch the dog, knowing that was still a line that couldn't be crossed, but he counted it as a victory nonetheless. That night, Frank awoke to a strange sensation. Shadow had moved from his corner and was now sleeping at the foot of the recliner, where Frank dozed. Not touching him, not fully trusting yet, but closer than he'd ever voluntarily come before. Well, I'll be damned, Frank whispered, careful not to move and break the fragile trust that had begun to form. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows of the cabin, a gentle sound that soon lulled them both back to sleep. The old man and the wounded dog, each carrying scars visible and invisible, finding in each other's presence something neither would have sought, but both, perhaps, needed. Chapter 3. Slow healing summer arrived in Vermont with an explosion of green life and warmth that seemed to transform the world around Frank's cabin. The forest that surrounded his property hummed with activity, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the occasional deer venturing close to graze in the small clearing behind the house. Inside, another transformation was taking place, slower but no less remarkable. Shadow's physical wounds had healed completely by mid-June, the fur growing back over the scar on his leg, though he still favored it slightly when tired. The emotional wounds, however, proved more stubborn. Progress came in small moments that might have seemed insignificant to anyone but Frank, who catalogued each one like precious evidence in an ongoing case. The first time Shadow took food directly from his hand, day 23. The first time the dog didn't flinch when Frank stood up suddenly, day 35. The first tentative wag of tail when Frank returned from a trip to town, day 42. There were setbacks too. The time Frank dropped a pan in the kitchen and Shadow cowered under the table for hours afterward. The thunderstorm that sent the dog into such a panic he clawed gouges in the back door trying to escape. The neighbor who visited unexpectedly and reached out to pet Shadow, resulting in a warning snap that narrowly missed the man's fingers. "He's dangerous, Frank," Roger Harris had said, backing toward his truck. "You know what they do to dogs that bite." "He didn't bite you," Frank had pointed out, standing protectively between his neighbor and Shadow, who was trembling on the porch. "And he gave you plenty of warning." Still, Roger had insisted, "A dog with that history, you're taking a risk." After Roger left, Frank had sat on the porch steps, Shadow gradually inching closer until he settled nearby, still watchful but no longer trembling. "You're not wrong to be careful," Frank told the dog. "Trust has to be earned. I get that better than most." Frank thought about his early days on the force, the skepticism he'd faced as a rookie from civilians and fellow officers alike. Trust wasn't given freely in that world. It was forged through shared experiences, proven reliability, consistent behavior. Why should it be any different for a dog who'd known only betrayal? One morning, in late June, Frank decided to try something new. He'd avoided the walking trails that crisscrossed his property, concerned about Shadow's reactions to the unfamiliar territory and potential triggers. But the dog had been restless lately, pacing the confines of the cabin and yard with increasing frequency. "What do you say we explore a bit?" Frank suggested, holding up the leash that Shadow now tolerated, though he still stiffened when it was attached to his collar. They set out on the easiest trail, a gentle path that wound through pines and maples before opening onto a small secluded pond. Shadow walked beside Frank rather than pulling ahead or lagging behind, his posture alert but not tense, ears swiveling to catch every forest sound. At the pond, Frank sat on a fallen log while Shadow investigated the shoreline, sniffing with obvious interest at beaver sign and deer tracks. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, the dog seemed like a dog, rather than a bundle of fear and defensive reactions. "You like it out here, don't you?" Frank observed. Shadow looked up at him, and Frank could have sworn there was a new light in those amber eyes, something beyond the wariness that had been there before. The dog trotted over, and to Frank's astonishment, sat directly beside him on the log, close enough that Frank could feel the warmth of him against his leg. Slowly, telegraphing his movements, Frank reached out a hand. Shadow watched it come, muscles tensing slightly but not moving away. When Frank's fingers made contact with the dog's head, Shadow flinched but didn't retreat or snap. Frank gently stroked the fur between his ears. "Good boy," he said softly, his voice rougher than usual with emotion. It lasted only a moment before Shadow stood and moved away, returning to his exploration of the pond edge, but it was enough. Contact freely given and accepted, another milestone. The daily walks became routine, expanding to include more challenging trails as Shadow's legs strengthened and his confidence grew. Frank found himself looking forward to these outings with an eagerness that surprised him. After Carol's death, he'd methodically structured his days around solitary activities, fishing, woodworking, reading. The introduction of another living being into his careful routine should have been an unwelcome disruption. Instead, he found himself rising earlier each morning, greeting Shadow with a ready-for-adventure that inevitably caused the dog's ears to perk up. He caught himself talking aloud as they walked, sharing observations about the weather, memories of cases he'd worked, even grief over Carol that he'd never articulated to another person. Shadow was a good listener, offering no judgment, no awkward platitudes, just attentive silence and increasingly physical proximity as they navigated the forest together. July brought a heat wave that drove them to the pond nearly every day, seeking relief in the shade of the surrounding pines. Frank had never been much of a swimmer since an incident in his youth, preferring to cool his feet at the edge while watching Shadow wade cautiously into the shallows. One particularly sweltering afternoon, Frank was dozing against a tree trunk when a splash jolted him awake. Shadow had ventured deeper than usual and was now swimming, awkwardly at first but with increasing confidence, chasing after a stick that had fallen into the water. "Well, look at you," Frank called, grinning as Shadow paddled back to shore, shook vigorously, then immediately looked for the stick again. "Want to play fetch, is that it?" Frank found a suitable stick and tossed it, watching in amazement as Shadow bounded after it without hesitation. The game continued until both man and dog were exhausted, collapsing in the shade together, Shadow's wet fur soaking Frank's shirt. "Carol would have loved you," Frank told him, not moving away from the dampness. "She always wanted a dog, but my hours at work," he trailed off, remembering the discussions they'd had, the agreement to wait until retirement. By the time that came, Carol's health was already failing, and the dream of a dog had been set aside like so many others. That evening, as they returned to the cabin, Frank realized Shadow was walking with a pronounced limp again, the old injury, aggravated by the unusual activity. Too much too soon, Frank chided himself, helping the dog up the porch steps. Inside, he settled Shadow on his bed, upgraded now from the pile of blankets to a proper orthopedic dog bed, and gently examined the leg. No obvious swelling, but clearly painful. Frank retrieved the remaining pain medication from Dr. Miller, hiding the pill in a piece of cheese as he'd learned to do. Shadow accepted it readily, trusting Frank in a way that would have been unthinkable 2 months earlier. "We'll take it easy tomorrow," Frank promised, sitting on the floor beside the dog bed and gently stroking Shadow's side. The dog sighed, relaxing under his touch. That night, Frank was awakened by a strange sound. He opened his eyes to find Shadow standing beside his bed, whining softly in the darkness. For a moment, Frank feared the pain had worsened, but when he sat up, Shadow simply moved closer, placing his head on the edge of the mattress. "Can't sleep?" Frank asked. Shadow whined again, eyes gleaming in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Frank hesitated only briefly before patting the space beside him. "Come on up then." Shadow needed no further invitation. With surprising agility for a dog with a sore leg, he leapt onto the bed and curled up against Frank's side, releasing a deep sigh that seemed to contain both contentment and relief. "Just for tonight," Frank murmured, even as he adjusted his position to accommodate his new bedmate. But it wasn't just for that night, of course. From then on, Shadow slept on the bed, his warm presence filling a space that had been empty for too long. Frank found he slept better with the dog there. The nightmares that occasionally plagued him, echoes of difficult cases, of Carol's final days, coming less frequently. By August, the transformation was remarkable. Shadow no longer cowered from sudden movements or unfamiliar sounds. He greeted Frank each morning with enthusiastic tail wagging and what could only be described as a doggy smile. He'd even begun to tolerate strangers, though he remained reserved, staying close to Frank when visitors came to the cabin. Dr. Miller, making a house call to check Shadow's progress, was astonished by the change. "I wouldn't have believed it if I wasn't seeing it with my own eyes," she admitted as Shadow voluntarily approached her for an ear scratch. "He's like a different dog. He just needed time," Frank said simply. Sarah gave him a knowing look, "and the right person. Don't underestimate what you've done here, Frank. This kind of rehabilitation, it's exceptional." Frank shrugged off the praise, uncomfortable with it as he always had been. But later, as he and Shadow walked their favorite trail to the pond, he found himself reflecting on Sarah's words. The right person. Was he really that for Shadow? He was no dog trainer, had no special skills or knowledge about canine rehabilitation. He'd simply offered what he could: patience, consistency, a safe space to heal. Perhaps that was enough. At the pond, Shadow splashed eagerly into the water, now a confident swimmer who delighted in retrieving sticks thrown ever farther. Frank watched him, this creature who had once been so broken by cruelty and fear, now playing with abandon in the late summer sunlight. "You're going to be fine," Frank said quietly. "Better than fine." Shadow emerged from the water and shook, deliberately close enough to spray Frank, who laughed and wiped his face. "Smartass," he accused fondly. The dog dropped his stick at Frank's feet and looked up expectantly, amber eyes clear and trusting. In that moment, Frank recognized something he hadn't fully acknowledged before. This wasn't just about rehabilitating an abused animal. Somewhere along the way, in the slow journey from fear to trust, Shadow had become something more: a companion, a friend, a reason to get up in the morning and face the day with something approaching enthusiasm. Frank threw the stick far out into the pond and watched Shadow dive in after it, strong legs propelling him through the water with confidence. "We saved each other," Frank realized aloud. "Didn't we, boy?" As if in answer, Shadow returned triumphantly with the stick, dropping it and pressing his wet body against Frank's legs in a gesture that could only be interpreted as affection. That evening, as they walked home in the golden light of sunset, Frank made a decision. Tomorrow, he would call the sheriff's department and officially adopt Shadow. No more limbo, no more temporary arrangement. The dog belonged with him now, and it was time to make it official. The path back to the cabin seemed shorter somehow, the forest around them alive with the sounds of early evening, birds settling for the night, the first crickets beginning their chorus, a gentle breeze rustling through leaves still green but hinting at the autumn to come. Frank felt a peace he hadn't known in years, walking beside the dog who had found his way past all defenses to become an essential part of a life Frank had thought complete in its solitude. Some wounds never fully heal, leaving scars that remain tender to the touch. But others, given time and care, can mend in ways that leave the injured stronger than before. As Shadow trotted beside him on the familiar trail home, Frank thought perhaps they both belonged to the latter category. Scarred but healing, stronger now for having found each other. Chapter 4. The test. Autumn painted Vermont's landscape in brilliant hues of red, orange, and gold, transforming Frank's property into a canvas of vibrant color. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and morning frost glittered on the grass outside the cabin. Shadow's official adoption papers had arrived in September, along with a new tag for his collar. No longer the tattered K9 unit identification, but a simple disc bearing his name and Frank's contact information. The formality seemed almost unnecessary. Shadow had clearly found his home. Frank's fishing trips now included a companion who would wait patiently on the riverbank, occasionally wading into the shallows to investigate something interesting but never straying far. Their daily walks had expanded to include more challenging terrain as Shadow's confidence and physical condition improved. The dog who had once been too terrified to eat in Frank's presence now slept beside him every night and followed him from room to room during the day, as if fearful of letting him out of sight. On a particularly beautiful October morning, with the maple trees ablaze against an impossibly blue sky, Frank decided to walk the perimeter trail that marked the boundary of his property. It was their longest route, a solid 5-mile loop that would take most of the day with stops for rest and lunch. "What do you say, boy? Up for an adventure?" Frank asked as he packed a small backpack with water, sandwiches, and treats for Shadow. The dog's enthusiastic barking and prancing by the door was answer enough. They set out just after dawn, Shadow trotting ahead along the familiar first stretch of trail before falling into step beside Frank as they entered denser forest. Frank had left the leash behind months ago. Shadow stayed closer without it than he ever had with it. The morning passed pleasantly as they made their way along the eastern boundary, stopping occasionally for water or to investigate something Shadow found fascinating. Usually animal signs that Frank couldn't detect, but the dog could clearly sense. By noon, they had reached the northernmost point of the property, a rocky outcropping that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. Frank settled on a sun-warmed stone to eat his lunch, tossing bits of turkey to Shadow, who caught them mid-air with impressive accuracy. "Not bad for an old failed police dog," Frank commented admiringly after a particularly acrobatic catch. Shadow tilted his head at the sound of Frank's voice, ears perked forward in that expression of attentive intelligence that never failed to make Frank smile. After lunch, they continued along the western boundary, which dipped down into a small ravine before climbing again toward the cabin. The descent was steeper than Frank remembered, and he found himself grabbing at tree trunks and branches to steady himself on the leaf-covered slope. "Getting too old for this," he muttered as his knee twinged painfully. Shadow seemed to sense his discomfort, staying closer than usual, occasionally looking back with what Frank could swear was concern. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, where a small stream gurgled over rocks, Frank decided to rest before tackling the climb back up. He lowered himself onto a fallen log with a grunt, massaging his aching knee. Shadow sat beside him, pressing warmly against his leg as if offering support. "Just need a minute," Frank assured him, reaching to scratch behind the dog's ear. The attack came without warning. One moment they were sitting peacefully by the stream, and the next a blur of movement erupted from the underbrush. A young black bear, likely a yearling separated from its mother, disoriented and frightened. It charged toward them with a huffing growl that seemed to freeze the very air in Frank's lungs. Frank had encountered bears before in his years living on the mountain, but never this close, never with this little warning. His mind flashed to the bear spray in his backpack, useless now with no time to reach it. Before Frank could even rise from the fallen log, Shadow was in motion. The dog launched himself directly at the charging bear, his barking suddenly deep and commanding in a way Frank had never heard before. Shadow positioned himself squarely between Frank and the threat, hackles raised, teeth bared. The bear, startled by this unexpected resistance, reared up on its hind legs, towering over Shadow at nearly 6 feet tall. From his position behind Shadow, Frank could see every muscle in the dog's body tensed, ready to fight despite being severely outmatched. "Shadow, no!" Frank shouted, struggling to his feet, knowing the dog didn't stand a chance against the bear's claws and strength. The bear swung a massive paw, catching Shadow along his side and sending him tumbling with a yelp of pain. Frank's heart lurched at the sound, but before he could move, Shadow was back on his feet, circling and darting in to snap at the bear's flank before retreating. It was a classic police K-9 technique, harassment and distraction rather than direct confrontation. Shadow was drawing the bear's attention away from Frank, giving him a chance to escape. "Shadow," Frank called again, grabbing a branch from the ground. The dog ignored him, continuing his strategic attacks on the confused and increasingly agitated bear. Frank knew he should retreat, find safety while Shadow provided this diversion. It was the logical move, the one that gave them both the best chance of survival. Instead, he found himself moving forward, branch raised, his voice joining Shadow's barks in a cacophony designed to intimidate. The bear, now faced with two opponents, seemed to hesitate. Shadow seized the moment, darting in close enough to nip at its hind leg. The bear swung around with surprising speed, and this time when the paw connected, Shadow went down hard. Rage filled Frank, a primal protective fury he hadn't felt in decades. He surged forward, roaring as loudly as he could, swinging the branch in wide arcs before him. The bear, perhaps deciding this meal wasn't worth the trouble, turned and crashed away through the underbrush, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Frank dropped the branch and rushed to Shadow, who lay unmoving on the forest floor, his breathing rapid and shallow. Blood matted the fur along his right side where the bear's claws had caught him. "Shadow," Frank said, his voice breaking as he knelt beside the injured dog. "You stubborn, brave idiot." Shadow's eyes flickered open at the sound of his name, and he attempted to rise, whimpering as the movement clearly caused pain. "Don't move, boy," Frank ordered gently, running hands carefully over the dog's body to assess the damage. The claw marks along Shadow's side were deep, but seemed to have missed vital organs. More concerning was the odd angle of his rib cage on the right side. At least 2 ribs were broken, possibly more. Frank needed to get Shadow back to the cabin, and then to Dr. Miller, but they were still over 2 miles from home through difficult terrain. Shadow weighed nearly 70 pounds, no small burden for a man in his 70s with a bad knee. "We're going to have to work together on this one," Frank told the dog, shrugging off his backpack and removing his flannel overshirt. With careful movements, he fashioned a makeshift bandage around Shadow's torso, trying to stabilize the ribs without restricting his breathing. Shadow endured the first aid stoically, only whimpering once when Frank had to lift him slightly to wrap the shirt around his chest. "Good boy," Frank murmured, his fingers gentle as they combed through blood-matted fur. "Best damn dog I've ever known." When the bandage was secure, Frank faced the next challenge, getting Shadow home. He couldn't carry the dog that distance, but neither could Shadow walk on his own. "I'm going to help you up," Frank explained, as if Shadow could understand every word. "We'll take it slow." With gentle coaxing and support, Frank managed to get Shadow standing, though the dog leaned heavily against his leg, clearly in pain with each breath. They began the arduous journey home, moving at a snail's pace, stopping frequently when Shadow needed rest. The climb up from the ravine was the worst part, with Frank practically carrying Shadow up the steepest sections. His own knee screamed in protest, and his back threatened to spasm, but somehow they kept going. Almost there, Frank encouraged as they finally reached level ground, though in truth they still had over a mile to go. Shadow's breathing had become increasingly labored, and fresh blood was seeping through the makeshift bandage, but the dog's eyes remained fixed on Frank, filled with a trust that squeezed Frank's heart like a vice. The sun was setting by the time the cabin came into view, casting long shadows across the clearing. Shadow had grown heavier against Frank's side with each step, and now he stumbled, legs finally giving out after the heroic effort. "No, no, come on," Frank urged, trying to support the dog's weight. "We're so close." But Shadow couldn't go any further. With a decision born of desperation, Frank lifted the injured dog into his arms, ignoring the protest of his aging body, and carried him the final distance to the cabin. By the time he reached the porch steps, Frank's vision was swimming with exertion, his breath coming in harsh gasps that matched Shadow's labored panting. He managed to get them both inside and laid Shadow gently on his bed before collapsing to his knees beside him. With trembling hands, Frank reached for the phone and dialed Dr. Miller's emergency number. "Sarah," he said, when she answered, his voice raw. "Shadow's hurt bad. Bear attack. Need help." The next few hours passed in a blur. Sarah arrived with her medical bag, her face grim as she examined Shadow. Frank hovered nearby, answering her questions mechanically while never taking his eyes off the dog. "2 broken ribs for certain," Sarah confirmed, "and these lacerations need proper cleaning and suturing. He needs to come to the clinic, Frank. I need to check for internal bleeding and punctured lung." Frank nodded, beyond words. Together they carefully moved Shadow to Sarah's vehicle, the dog whimpering despite their gentle handling. At the clinic, X-rays confirmed the broken ribs and revealed a hairline fracture to Shadow's right shoulder blade. Miraculously, there was no punctured lung or significant internal bleeding, though severe bruising would make Shadow's recovery painful. "He saved my life," Frank told Sarah, as they watched Shadow sleep off the anesthesia following the surgical repair of his wounds. "That bear was coming straight for me." He didn't hesitate, Sarah, not for a second. Sarah squeezed Frank's shoulder. "That's what he was trained to do, Frank. Protect his handler." "But I'm not his handler," Frank protested. "I'm just the guy who happened to find him in a trap." Sarah gave him a knowing look. "You're a lot more than that to him now." Shadow remained at the clinic for 3 days under observation. Frank visited for hours each day, sitting beside the kennel, sometimes reading aloud from whatever book he'd brought along, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence while Shadow dozed. Word of the bear attack spread quickly through the small town, and Frank found himself fielding questions at the diner and general store. "That dog of yours is a hero," Roger Harris said, when they crossed paths at the post office, his previous concerns about Shadow's dangerous nature apparently forgotten. "Don't know many dogs that would take on a bear. Don't know many humans who would either," Frank replied dryly. When Shadow was finally cleared to come home, he wore a substantial bandage around his torso and had strict instructions for limited movement during recovery. Frank had prepared for this, rearranging the living room furniture to create a comfortable convalescent area where Shadow could rest while remaining part of household activities. The first night home, Shadow seemed restless despite the pain medication, unable to settle in his bed despite its proximity to Frank's recliner. After watching the dog struggle to find a comfortable position for nearly an hour, Frank made a decision. "Come on," he said, carefully helping Shadow to his feet. "Let's try something else." He guided the dog to his bedroom and patted the mattress. "Up you go." With some assistance, Shadow settled on the bed, immediately relaxing into the familiar space. Frank changed into pajamas and carefully climbed in beside him, arranging himself so that Shadow could rest against him without pressure on his injuries. "You know," Frank said, stroking Shadow's head gently as the dog's eyes began to drift closed, "I always wondered what made a good police dog. I figured it was the training, the obedience, the skills they learn. But it's not that, is it? It's the heart, the willingness to put yourself between danger and the ones you care about." Shadow sighed, pressing closer to Frank's side. "You never finished your police training," Frank continued softly, "but you're every inch a police dog, the best of them." As if in agreement, Shadow rested his muzzle on Frank's chest, his breathing deepening into sleep. Frank lay awake long after Shadow drifted off, his mind replaying the attack, imagining how differently it might have ended without the dog's intervention. He thought of the cruel irony that Shadow, once deemed too aggressive to complete police training, had channeled that same protective instinct to save Frank's life. "Second chances," Frank murmured to the sleeping dog. "We both got one, didn't we?" Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin windows and sending fallen leaves skittering across the porch. Inside, man and dog slept peacefully, bound by something deeper than either could have anticipated on that spring day when their paths first crossed on a lonely mountain road. Chapter 5. The final journey. Winter settled over Vermont in a silent blanket of white, transforming Frank's property into a pristine landscape of snow-laden pines and bare-branched maples. The cabin stood like a warm island in a sea of snow, smoke curling from its chimney into the crystalline air. Inside, life had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Shadow's injuries had healed well, though the cold made his ribs ache sometimes, causing him to move stiffly until he warmed by the fire. Frank's knee likewise protested the winter weather, a shared discomfort that seemed to deepen the bond between them. Their walks had shortened due to both the weather and their respective old injuries, but they still ventured out daily, Shadow bounding through drifts while Frank trudged behind, watching the dog's exuberance with undisguised affection. "You'd never know you tangled with a bear a few months ago," Frank observed one January morning, as Shadow rolled ecstatically in a fresh snowfall, his dark fur powdered white. The dog's recovery had been remarkable, though not without setbacks. The broken ribs had healed cleanly, but Shadow retained a slight limp in his right front leg from the shoulder blade fracture, more pronounced when he was tired or when the weather turned. Dr. Miller had warned that arthritis would likely set in early in that joint, an inevitability Frank understood all too well from his own aging body, but these small imperfections didn't diminish Shadow in Frank's eyes. If anything, they enhanced the dog's dignity, battle scars that spoke of courage and sacrifice. As winter deepened, they spent more time indoors, Shadow dozing by the fire, while Frank read or worked on small woodworking projects. Sometimes, on particularly bitter nights, Frank would pull his recliner closer to the hearth, and Shadow would climb into his lap despite his considerable size, both of them seeking the comfort of shared warmth and companionship. It was during one such evening, with snow tapping gently against the windows and the fire crackling low in the grate, that Frank first noticed the chest pain, a tightness, like a band slowly constricting around his ribcage. He'd felt something similar during particularly stressful cases in his police days. Stress, the department doctor had said. Nothing to worry about, but Frank was 73 now, not 40, and the pain felt different somehow, more insistent, less willing to be ignored. Still, he said nothing to Dr. Miller during Shadow's next checkup, dismissing it as indigestion, age, the cold, anything but what he suspected it might be. February brought a brief thaw, turning the snow to slush and revealing patches of brown earth beneath. Frank and Shadow extended their walks, enjoying the respite from the bitter cold. They even made it to the pond, now a sheet of gray ice, with a dusting of snow across its surface. Shadow limped more noticeably on the return journey, and Frank felt the now familiar tightness in his chest as they climbed the gentle slope toward home. He paused, leaning against a tree to catch his breath, and Shadow immediately stopped beside him, looking up with concerned eyes. "I'm fine," Frank assured him, though the pain had intensified to a burning sensation that radiated down his left arm. "Just old." That night, Frank woke suddenly from a deep sleep, disoriented and drenched in cold sweat. The pain in his chest was crushing now, stealing his breath. Shadow was already awake, whining softly, and pushing his nose against Frank's face. "Good boy," Frank managed, his voice barely audible as he reached for the phone on his nightstand. His fingers felt numb and clumsy, unable to grip the device. Shadow jumped from the bed and disappeared, returning moments later with the cordless phone in his mouth. A trick Frank had taught him during the long winter evenings, never imagining it would be needed like this. Frank took the phone with trembling hands, but the simple act of dialing 911 seemed suddenly complex beyond comprehension. The numbers blurred before his eyes, and the phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. Shadow barked sharply, the sound piercing through the fog enveloping Frank's mind. "Help," Frank whispered, knowing with sudden clarity that he was having a heart attack, and that his isolated cabin, so perfect for a man who valued solitude, had become a potential death trap. The nearest neighbor was Roger Harris, over a mile away through snow-covered forest. The chances of someone happening by at Frank squinted at the bedside clock. 2:17 a.m. were non-existent. Shadow barked again, more insistently this time, then raced to the bedroom door, looking back at Frank with an urgency that transcended the barrier between species. "Go," Frank urged, understanding somehow what the dog was proposing. "Get Roger." Shadow hesitated, returning to the bed to press his nose briefly against Frank's hand before racing for the front door. Frank heard the distinctive sound of the dog door, installed after Shadow's recovery from the bear attack, flapping as the dog pushed through it into the winter night. Frank closed his eyes against another wave of pain. The house felt suddenly empty without Shadow's presence, the silence broken only by his own labored breathing and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, Shadow faced a critical choice. The most direct route to Roger Harris's farm required crossing the frozen pond, a dangerous shortcut in the February thaw, but one that could save precious minutes. The alternative was the longer path around, following the road that wound through the forest. Shadow, limping but determined, chose the pond. His paws broke through the melting surface ice with each step, but the water remained frozen enough beneath to support his weight, barely. Halfway across, the ice gave way more significantly, plunging his back legs into the frigid water before he managed to scramble forward onto firmer ice, his injured shoulder protesting each desperate movement. On the far side, Shadow paused only long enough to shake off the worst of the freezing water before continuing his mission, following the familiar trail toward Roger's farm. His pace was hampered by his limp, now more pronounced from the cold and exertion, but he pressed on, driven by an instinct deeper than training. At Roger's farm, Shadow barked frantically at the door, until lights appeared in the windows, and Roger emerged in his bathrobe, shotgun in hand until he recognized the visitor. "Shadow, what the hell?" The dog barked again, backing up a few steps before returning to tug at Roger's bathrobe. "Frank," Roger said, understanding dawning. Something's wrong with Frank. He disappeared inside, returning moments later fully dressed and reaching for his truck keys. Shadow barked sharply, clearly unwilling to wait for Roger to navigate the rutted forest road in his pickup. All right, Roger conceded, grabbing a flashlight and his medical kit. As a volunteer firefighter, he'd had basic emergency training. "Lead the way." Shadow turned and began retracing his steps, frequently looking back to ensure Roger was following. The man struggled to keep up with the dog's urgent pace, his own aging knees protesting the uneven terrain and pre-dawn cold. "Slow down a bit, boy," Roger called. "Can't help Frank if I break my neck getting there." Shadow slowed marginally, but continued to forge ahead with single-minded determination, choosing the longer route around the pond for Roger's benefit despite the precious time time it cost. Back at the cabin, Frank drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening bringing fresh waves of pain that seemed to consume his entire chest. He'd managed to slide from the bed to the floor, thinking vaguely of crawling to the front door, but had made it only a few feet before his strength gave out entirely. The phosphorescent hands of his watch showed 3:26 a.m. when Frank heard Shadow's bark outside, followed by the sound of Roger's voice calling his name. Relief washed over him, followed immediately by concern for Shadow. Had the dog really made the 3-mile round trip through the winter night, with his injuries? The front door burst open, and suddenly Roger was kneeling beside him, his face grim as he checked Frank's pulse and pupils. "Hang on, old man," Roger said, reaching for his radio to call for emergency medical assistance. "Your dog just pulled a damn lassie." Shadow appeared in the bedroom doorway, soaking wet and trembling with cold and exhaustion, but clearly relieved to find Frank still conscious. He limped forward to gently lick Frank's face before collapsing beside him, his body pressed close as if to share what warmth he had left. "Good boy," Frank whispered, his hand finding Shadow's damp fur. "Best dog ever." The wait for the ambulance seemed interminable. Roger did what he could, elevating Frank's legs, covering him with blankets, administering the aspirin from the emergency kit. Shadow refused to leave Frank's side even when Roger tried to dry him with towels, the dog's eyes never leaving Frank's face. When the paramedics finally arrived, their assessment was swift and concerning: definite myocardial infarction, critical condition, immediate transport needed. As they loaded Frank onto the stretcher, his only question was about Shadow. "My neighbor will take care of him," Roger assured him. "You focus on staying alive." The last thing Frank saw as they carried him from the cabin was Shadow standing in the doorway, wet and shivering but somehow dignified in his vigil, watching as the man who had saved him was now taken away to be saved by others. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of hospital rooms, medical terms, and procedures. Triple bypass surgery, intensive care, cautious optimism. Frank processed it all through a haze of medication and fatigue, his first coherent thought being of Shadow. When Dr. Sarah Miller appeared in his hospital room on the 4th day, Frank initially thought the medication was causing hallucinations. "You're not my cardiologist," he mumbled. Sarah smiled. "No, but I thought you might want news of your other patient." Frank struggled to sit up straighter. "Shadow, is he okay?" Sarah's expression grew serious. "He's alive, but I won't sugarcoat it, Frank. The swim across the partially frozen pond in February, the 3-mile round trip through the snow with his existing injuries, it took a toll." "How bad?" "Hypothermia, exhaustion, and his old injuries are inflamed. He's also developed pneumonia from the cold and the water." Sarah paused. "But that's not the worst of it. On his way back to Rogers with you, he was so focused on getting help that he ran onto the road without checking. A car swerved to avoid him but still clipped him. His right hind leg was badly fractured." Frank closed his eyes, imagining Shadow's desperate journey through the dark, already injured and cold, then being struck by a car, yet still continuing his mission. "He's at my clinic now," Sarah continued, "on IV antibiotics and pain management. Roger brought him in right after the ambulance took you away." "Will he?" Frank couldn't finish the question. "Recover?" Sarah's professional demeanor softened. "His body has been through an enormous trauma, Frank, and he's not young. The pneumonia is my biggest concern right now. The fracture we can manage, but his respiratory system is compromised." Frank nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Shadow's chances were uncertain at best. "He saved my life," Frank said simply. "Twice now." "I know," Sarah replied. "Roger told me everything. The whole town's talking about it." Frank turned to look out the window at the gray February sky. "Can I see him?" "Not yet. You both need to focus on recovery right now." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I promise I'm giving him the best care possible." The days that followed established a new routine. Frank's physical recovery progressed steadily, his damaged heart growing stronger each day. But his thoughts remained constantly with Shadow, whose condition fluctuated dramatically according to Sarah's daily updates. "The pneumonia seems to be responding to the antibiotics," she reported one day, only to return the next with news of a setback. "His temperature's elevated again. We're changing the antibiotic protocol." Frank pushed himself in physical therapy, determined to recover enough to leave the hospital and see Shadow. His cardiologist noted his improved vital signs with approval but remained firm about the necessary recovery time. "Your dog is getting excellent care," Dr. Patel assured him. "But if you rush your recovery and end up back here, you won't be able to help him at all." Reluctantly, Frank acknowledged the wisdom in this and focused on following the medical advice precisely, viewing each small improvement as one step closer to reuniting with Shadow. 2 weeks after his heart attack, Frank was finally deemed stable enough for a brief supervised excursion. Sarah arrived at the hospital with a wheelchair and a nurse who had volunteered to accompany them to the veterinary clinic. "He's had a relatively good day," Sarah told Frank as they drove through the quiet town streets. "His fever's down, and he's been a bit more alert." The clinic was silent when they entered, most of the day's appointments completed. Sarah led Frank to the kennel area in the back, where Shadow occupied the largest enclosure, modified to accommodate his IV lines and the cast on his hind leg. Frank's breath caught in his throat at the sight of the dog. Shadow lay on a thick pad, his body thinner than Frank remembered, the cast bulky against his diminished frame. IV lines ran to both front legs, and an oxygen line helped support his labored breathing. But it was Shadow's eyes that struck Frank most deeply, still alert despite everything, still watching the door as if expecting Frank to walk through it at any moment. When Shadow saw Frank in the wheelchair, his reaction was immediate and heart-wrenching. He tried to rise despite the IV lines and cast, a faint whine escaping as he struggled to reach his person. "Easy, boy," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion as the nurse wheeled him closer to the kennel. "I'm here." Sarah opened the kennel door, and Frank reached in to gently stroke Shadow's head. The dog leaned into his touch, his tail thumping weakly against the padding. "You did good," Frank told him, tears welling in his eyes. "You did so good, Shadow. Now you just have to get better, okay? We both do." Shadow seemed to understand, his eyes never leaving Frank's face as the man continued to stroke his fur and murmur encouragement. For the first time since being admitted to the clinic, Shadow's breathing eased slightly, his body relaxing under Frank's familiar touch. "He's been waiting for you," Sarah observed quietly, holding on. Frank nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He remained beside Shadow until the nurse gently reminded him that they needed to return to the hospital. Even then, Frank was reluctant to leave, promising Shadow he would return soon. As they prepared to depart, Shadow summoned his remaining strength to lick Frank's hand once, the gesture so full of devotion it nearly undid Frank completely. "I'll be back tomorrow," Frank promised. "You rest now." That night in his hospital room, Frank lay awake, thinking of Shadow's weakened state and the long road to recovery ahead for both of them. His own convalescence would require months of careful rehabilitation. Shadow's injuries, compounded by the pneumonia, presented an even more uncertain future. But they would face it together, Frank decided. Whatever adaptations were needed, ramps instead of stairs, shorter walks, special medications, he would provide them. Shadow had given everything to save him. Frank would do no less in return. The call came at 3:17 a.m., jolting Frank from a restless sleep. Sarah's voice on the hospital phone was gentle but carried an unmistakable gravity. "His condition has deteriorated rapidly in the last hour," she explained. "The pneumonia, his lungs are failing, Frank. I've done everything medically possible, but I need to see him," Frank interrupted, already reaching for the call button to summon a nurse. "I've already spoken to Dr. Patel," Sarah assured him. "He's making arrangements for temporary release with a medical escort. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The night nurse helped Frank dress and transferred him to a wheelchair as they waited for Sarah. Dr. Patel arrived personally to review Frank's vital signs and provide strict instructions to the medical aide who would accompany them. 1 hour maximum, the cardiologist said firmly, and at the first sign of distress, you return immediately. The journey to the clinic passed in tense silence, Frank staring out at the dark streets, glistening with fresh snowfall. Inside, Sarah led them directly to Shadow, who had been moved to a quieter room, away from the other animals. Frank could hear the labored breathing before he even entered, the distinctive rattle of fluid-filled lungs fighting for oxygen. Shadow lay on a soft blanket, an oxygen mask fitted over his muzzle, his once vibrant body now terribly still, except for the strained rise and fall of his chest. "Can I hold him?" Frank asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, helping Frank from the wheelchair to the floor beside Shadow. With gentle movements, they shifted the dog so his head rested in Frank's lap, careful not to disturb the oxygen line or IV. Shadow's eyes, clouded with pain and medication, found Frank's face. Recognition flickered there, followed by what Frank could only describe as relief. The dog's breathing remained labored, but some of the tension seemed to ease from his body as Frank stroked his fur with trembling hands. "You did everything right," Frank told him, leaning close so Shadow could hear his whispered words. "You saved me, you brought help, the best damn police dog there ever was." Shadow's tail moved slightly, the ghost of a wag, at the tone of pride in Frank's voice. "I was supposed to be saving you," Frank continued, his vision blurring with tears, "but it turns out you saved me in ways I never expected, not just from the bear or the heart attack, from loneliness, from giving up." Sarah stood quietly by the door, giving them privacy while monitoring the situation professionally. The medical aide remained nearby, watchful of Frank's condition. Outside, snow continued to fall, coating the world in pristine white. Inside, man and dog shared their final moments together, the bond between them transcending the barriers of species and language. Shadow's breathing grew increasingly labored despite the oxygen support. Each breath seemed to require more effort than the last, his body fighting a battle it could no longer win. "It's okay to let go," Frank whispered, his tears falling onto Shadow's fur. "You've done enough, more than enough." As if waiting for permission, Shadow exhaled a long, shuddering breath. His eyes, fixed on Frank's face, held such trust and love that Frank felt his heart might break all over again, this time from grief rather than physical failure. With the last of his strength, Shadow lifted his head slightly, just enough to press his muzzle against Frank's hand one final time. Then he settled back, his breathing slowed, and with one last gentle exhale, stopped altogether. "He's gone," Sarah said softly, moving forward to confirm what Frank already knew. "He waited for you." Frank nodded, unable to speak, his hands still stroking the fur that was already cooling beneath his touch. The room fell silent, except for the soft hiss of the disconnected oxygen and the muted sound of fresh snow tapping against the windows. Outside, the world continued turning, unconcerned with the small tragedy unfolding within the clinic walls. But for Frank, everything had stopped, frozen in the moment when Shadow's eyes closed for the final time. "He was the best of us," Frank said finally, his voice raw. "He forgave when he had every reason not to. He protected when he'd never been protected. He loved unconditionally, when all he'd known was cruelty." Sarah rested a hand on Frank's shoulder. "He found exactly who he needed to find, that day on the road. And I found who I needed," Frank replied simply. Together they sat in the quiet room as the snow continued falling outside, covering the world in a blanket of white that matched the pure devotion of the dog who had given everything to save the man who had saved him. Epilogue Spring returned to Vermont, painting Frank's property with the same vibrant green palette as the year before. The forest surrounding the cabin came alive with bird song and new growth, the cycle of renewal indifferent to the grief that still lingered within the cabin walls. Frank stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the morning mist rise from the pond in the distance. His recovery had been slow but steady. Weekly cardiac rehabilitation, a carefully monitored diet, daily walks that gradually increased in length as his strength returned. The walks were the hardest part, not physically, though his healing heart sometimes protested, but emotionally. Each step along the familiar trails echoed with the absence of Shadow trotting beside him, investigating interesting scents, occasionally looking back as if to ensure Frank was still following. On his bedside table sat a small wooden box containing Shadow's ashes, alongside a framed photograph Sarah had taken during one of their visits to the clinic. Shadow and Frank together, the dog's head resting contentedly in Frank's lap. Beside these stood a plaque recently presented by the town council, commemorating Shadow's heroism in saving Frank's life. The ceremony had been unexpectedly moving, attended by nearly everyone in town, many of whom shared stories of their own encounters with the remarkable dog who had overcome trauma to become a local hero. Roger Harris, in particular, had spoken eloquently about witnessing Shadow's determination that February night. Some people say animals don't have souls, Roger had concluded, but anybody who saw that dog fighting through pain and fear to save his person knows different. Frank traced his fingers over the plaque each night before sleep, a ritual of remembrance and gratitude. On this particular morning, 6 months after his heart attack, Frank decided to walk the full perimeter trail for the first time since his recovery. Dr. Patel had cleared him for extended activity, and something about the perfect spring day called him to retrace the steps he and Shadow had taken on that fateful October day. The hike was slow and deliberate. Frank stopped often to rest, carrying water and emergency medication in a small backpack. The descent into the ravine where the bear had attacked gave him pause, memories flooding back with such clarity that he could almost hear Shadow's warning bark. At the bottom, near the stream where they had rested, Frank sat on the same fallen log. The forest was peaceful around him, showing no sign of the life-altering confrontation that had taken place there. He closed his eyes, listening to the gurgle of the stream and the rustle of new leaves overhead. "I miss you every day," he said aloud, knowing there was no one to hear but feeling the need to voice the words nonetheless. "But I'm keeping my promise. I'm taking care of myself, living for both of us now." The return journey felt lighter somehow, as if speaking the words had released some small portion of his grief. As the cabin came into view, Frank paused at the edge of the clearing, remembering how he had carried Shadow the final distance that day, both of them wounded but alive. Later that afternoon, as Frank sat on his porch watching the day fade toward evening, a car appeared on the rarely used access road. He recognized Sarah Miller's sedan as it rolled to a stop beside his truck. "Thought I'd check on my favorite patient," she called as she emerged, carrying her medical bag. "Roger mentioned he saw you heading out for the full perimeter walk this morning. Checking up on me?" Frank asked, but there was no annoyance in his tone. Sarah's concern had been a constant support during his recovery. "Professional obligation," she replied with a smile, joining him on the porch. She performed a quick check of his vitals, nodding with satisfaction at the results. "You're doing remarkably well," she observed. "How did the walk feel?" "Good," Frank said. "Different, but good." Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. "I have something for you," she said after a moment, returning to her car to retrieve a folder. Frank accepted it with curiosity, opening it to find adoption papers from the county animal shelter. "What's this?" "Just an option," Sarah explained. "No pressure at all. But they got a dog in last week that reminded me of someone." As if on cue, a bark sounded from the direction of Sarah's car. Frank turned, his breath catching as Sarah opened the rear door to reveal a German Shepherd puppy, perhaps 4 months old. Unlike Shadow's dark coloring, this dog had a lighter coat with distinctive facial markings, but the amber eyes were hauntingly familiar as they regarded Frank with cautious interest. "She was found abandoned near the interstate," Sarah explained as the puppy hesitantly descended from the car. "No microchip, no collar. The shelter thinks she might have been part of an irresponsible breeding operation. She's shy with most people, but I thought you two might understand each other." The puppy remained beside Sarah's car, clearly uncertain about this new person and place. Frank slowly lowered himself to sitting on the porch steps, remembering how he'd first gained Shadow's trust. "What's her name?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the dog. "She doesn't have one yet," Sarah replied. "I thought, if you were interested, you might want to choose." Frank nodded, then addressed the puppy directly. "I'm not looking to replace who I lost," he said softly. "No one could ever do that. But I've got room in my life for someone new, if you're willing to take a chance on an old man." The puppy tilted her head, ears perked forward at the sound of his voice. After a moment's consideration, she took a tentative step toward the porch. "Take your time," Frank encouraged. "We've got nothing but time." Sarah placed a bag of puppy food and supplies on the porch. "I'll leave these here, no obligation, just think about it. She'll need a home where someone understands her background, has patience with her fears." Frank nodded, his eyes still on the puppy, who had ventured a few more steps closer. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." After Sarah departed, Frank remained sitting on the steps as evening settled around them. The puppy maintained her distance, watching him with the same wariness Shadow had shown in those early days. "Your choice," Frank told her, rising stiffly to his feet. "Doors open if you want to come in. If not, the food will be here for you anyway." Inside the cabin, Frank moved to the window, watching as the puppy cautiously approached the porch after he'd gone. She sniffed at the bag of food, then at the open doorway, clearly conflicted. Frank busied himself making dinner, deliberately creating normal household sounds to help the puppy acclimate. When he returned to check the porch 20 minutes later, both the puppy and the bag of food were gone. A stab of disappointment went through him, though he understood. Trust couldn't be rushed. As he prepared for bed that night, Frank found himself talking to Shadow's memory as he had often done during his recovery. "There was a puppy today," he said to the small box of ashes. "Reminded me of you, though not as stubborn looking. Probably for the best that she ran off. Starting over isn't easy at my age." A noise from the porch caught his attention, a soft whine, barely audible. Frank moved to the front door and opened it carefully. The puppy sat there, the bag of food beside her, torn open where she had managed to extract a single piece of kibble. She looked up at Frank, then at the open door, then back at him, as if weighing a momentous decision. "Whatever you decide," Frank told her quietly, "it's okay." He backed away from the door, giving her space to enter or retreat as she chose. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with deliberate steps, the puppy crossed the threshold into the cabin, pausing just inside to survey this new territory. Frank remained still, allowing her to explore at her own pace. She circled the living room cautiously, sniffing at furniture and lingering especially long at Shadow's old bed, still positioned near the fireplace. Eventually, she returned to where Frank stood and sat, looking up at him with eyes that asked questions he couldn't fully understand, but felt in his heart nonetheless. "Welcome home, Hope," he said, the name coming to him unbidden but feeling instantly right. "We'll figure it out together." Hope didn't approach close enough for him to touch her, maintaining a cautious distance, but she didn't flee either. It was a beginning, tenuous and uncertain, but real. That night, Hope slept on Shadow's bed, while Frank took his usual place in his bedroom. In the quiet darkness, he thought about second chances, and third ones too. About how grief doesn't end, but can make room for new joy. About how saving someone else can sometimes be the best way to honor those you've lost. Outside, spring rain began to patter against the roof, gentle and cleansing. Inside, man and dog slept under the same roof, strangers still in many ways, but connected already by invisible threads of shared experience and the universal need for healing companionship. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments of trust built or tested, new discoveries about each other. But for tonight, it was enough that Hope had chosen to stay, that Frank had opened his heart to the possibility of a new connection, and that somewhere perhaps, Shadow's loyal spirit looked on with approval. In the quiet cabin nestled among Vermont's green mountains, life continued its imperfect, beautiful journey, reminding all who cared to listen that sometimes the most profound love arises from the most unexpected encounters, and that even the most broken souls can find their way to healing through the simple miracle of being truly seen by another. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to the K9 Code Red channel for more tales of extraordinary canine heroism and the lives they transform. Leave a comment about what this story of loyalty, sacrifice, and new beginnings means to you. How has an animal changed your life? What second chances have you experienced or given? Your story matters too. Remember that sometimes, the souls who need love the most are the ones who have been hurt the deepest, and sometimes, in saving them, we discover that we ourselves are being saved. The end.